Hello and welcome to this introduction to Biodiversity Net Gain webinar. Today I'll be giving you a lay of the land for all things BNG and help you understand what's relevant for you and some steps to get started. But first, who am I? My name is Jada Anderson and I'm an evolutionary ecologist and mathematician, and I'm also the CTO and co-founder of Xylo Systems. Xylo Systems is a biodiversity intelligence platform supporting developers to quickly and cheaply meet compliance, make data-driven decisions, and minimize their impact. So let's start with what is Biodiversity Net Gain, also known as BNG. As of the 12th of February last year, 2024, BNG is a mandatory planning policy in England as part of the Environment Act 2021. It requires new developments that need planning approval to increase biodiversity by 10% post-development and maintain it for 30 years. It's the first of its kind in the world, demonstrating how government plays a key role in providing the methodology and structure in which developers must think about biodiversity beyond voluntary disclosures like the Task Force for Nature-related Financial Disclosures, or the TNFD. Whilst this sounds very exciting for ecologists like myself, it's also a big burden and additional hoop that developers need to jump through in order to receive approvals to develop. And today we'll cover how we can reduce this burden for you. So why does BNG matter? Well, as mentioned, this is something that all developers are going to have to think about as they go and do their planning approvals. They have to include a BNG plan as part of this process now. We also are recognizing that this is a significant kind of output from public and stakeholder demand for nature positive development. And finally, it's sort of a compromise or a meet in the middle in terms of the two challenges. One, that we have this severely dramatic decline in biodiversity in England over the last sort of 20 to 30 years, but also that there is a housing crisis. We need to continue developing. And so this is a solution that allows developers to keep doing what they do best whilst making sure that nature is a stakeholder in these decisions. So who needs to comply? Well, primarily those who own and develop land. Now, this includes both large-scale developers as well as developers of smaller sites. And there are two slightly different BNG processes depending on which development type your project falls under. Both are very similar, but small sites have a slightly easier and simpler version of this BNG tool that they have to complete. There are also many other relevant stakeholders involved in getting your plan approved and finalised, including the local planning authorities who will approve your plans, also known as LPAs, ecologists who can provide on-the-ground expertise and site walkovers, and landowners who can contribute to local habitat banks and provide solutions for offsetting. There are many others depending on what kind of site you're working on, but these are just a few to give you an idea of how this is really a multi-stakeholder process. So let's get into the meat and bones of this process. The primary thing that a lot of developers get stuck on is this metric tool. So it's available on the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs, or DEFRA, website in the form of a macro-enabled Excel tool. It has a pretty hefty user manual attached, but here I'll start to explain the ins and outs of what the tool actually looks like. You can see in the screenshot here that it's got a kind of four major steps that I'll walk you through in just a moment. But the kind of broader method that this tool implements is that we are quantifying habitat units on your site. So this includes a baseline before any development occurs, and then a measurement of habitat units after the site has been developed on. And the idea is that you need to increase your total habitat units by 10% post-development and demonstrate that that's possible to the LPA before you go ahead. There's a lot here, as I mentioned. You can also see that in this tool that we break it down to kind of three major categories: habitats, hedgerows, and watercourses. Not all three of these will be relevant for all sites, of course. If you don't have hedgerows or watercourses, it'll just be habitats. But it's important to recognize it's been broken down into those three steps. You will need to attach a completed version of this metric tool alongside a biodiversity net gain plan as part of your planning approvals as well. So let's do a bit of a deeper dive into each of these steps so you understand what's involved. The first step is the baselining habitat survey. And actually, before I jump into that, I just want to mention that this process, these 4 steps, are based on what we call a conservation mitigation hierarchy. If you're involved in things like TNFD disclosures, this might sound familiar, but essentially this means that we are following 4 sort of major sequential steps when it comes to protecting nature. The first is avoiding having any impact on nature where possible. The second is if we're going to have an impact, we need to minimize it. The next is how can we restore habitat? And the last and final option is offsetting. This ensures that we can kind of prevent harm to nature where possible. And then we can look at how we can offset that impact if it's not possible in some circumstances. So, based on that context, the first step is actually to understand before any development goes forward, what kind of habitat do we have on site? What is the baseline state of nature on your site that you're planning to develop? So this includes doing data gathering on the site, as well as looking at whether there are any significant or irreplaceable ecosystems, such as ancient woodlands or salt marsh ecosystems on your site. If there are, that requires some additional steps, but it's good to understand those or the state of nature on your site as soon as possible. And this data will be put into the tool down the track. The second step is to actually understand what does this site look like post-development? What kind of habitat are we going to have? Does this include any habitat creation or habitat enhancement? All of this will be used to help calculate what your net change in biodiversity on that site is. But that involves having a really detailed plan as to what biodiversity will look like post-development. The third is to then do the BNG calculation. So essentially put all of this data, both from the baselining habitat survey as well as the design plans that you have post-development, into this biodiversity net gain metric tool. And the tool can automatically produce what were the habitat units in that baseline, what are the habitat units from your designs, and what is that net change from the output of that. And that will give you an indication of have you actually met that 10% net gain goal. And if you haven't, it will then trigger you to start thinking about what are your options from there. And that leads us to the 4th step, which is offsetting or contributing to biodiversity offsite. So there are kind of 2 options here. One is enhancing biodiversity offsite. To do this, you have to prove that it's not possible on site. And where not possible for offsite, how can you purchase biodiversity units from existing habitat banks in the area? Whilst this might sound like the simplest option, it can be quite expensive, and we've heard this feedback quite a lot that it really isn't feasible for a lot of particularly small developers to afford purchasing habitat units from these banks because it's really quite expensive. So it's important to be as proactive as possible, and I'll reiterate this multiple times that being proactive and understanding the state of nature on your site so you can potentially increase net gain of biodiversity on your site is a really important step. So there's kind of 4 key steps here, all really integrated with data and understanding what is possible when it comes to increasing biodiversity for your project. That's a very quick lay of the land. I now want to jump into some practical steps, some sort of lessons learned from conversations I've had with developers who have been through this process and learned the lessons the hard way. The first one is to do your baseline survey as early as possible in the project as possible. You may not want to be, you don't want to be surprised when designs have been set, operations have been set into motion, and you realize that you have some fundamental roadblocks in the way, like the presence of an irreplaceable habitat. So if you can do your baseline survey early, you can be much more proactive about how you can integrate the BNG process into your planning and design phases. And you have much more scope to increase biodiversity on site if you start incorporating this at the design stage. So it might seem like something that's a problem for later, but I really encourage you to think about this baseline survey as early as possible. The next is to use this biodiversity metric tool to your advantage and use it to model scenarios. So exploring how you can meet 10% net gain through creative design or a combination of on and off-site strategies can be really helpful to save you spending a lot of money on, purchasing units through habitat banks down the future or down the track. So it really is helpful to use this tool to your advantage and play around with different scenarios once you know what your habitat units are on site through that baselining. The next is to plan for the long term. So I didn't touch on this much earlier, but as part of the BNG process, you have to maintain or demonstrate that that biodiversity on site can be maintained for 30 years post-development. And you need to develop a plan for how you're going to maintain and monitor that biodiversity for 30 years post-development. So really be conscious of how you can protect and be really sort of conscious of the resilience of the biodiversity on that site, particularly in the context of 30 years down the track. There are things that will change, like increasing temperatures due to climate change. Really focusing on the resilience of that biodiversity will be key to ensuring that your plan gets approved. The next is to engage with LPAs and their local nature plans as early as possible. So understanding the unique nuances of your local borough early is really important to find out if they have a local nature recovery strategy. Many are in the process of developing and releasing them this year, 2025. And so really making sure you're staying on top of whether there are nuances, whether some LPAs have increased the BNG goals by more than 10% as well. That is happening in some cases, and understand how it might impact your plans as well. And finally, this is a very data heavy process and you don't have to do it alone. I might be biased, but I really encourage you to think about how tools like Xylo Systems can support you in streamlining your BNG plans and get your project moving without delays. We provide all the satellite data required, can do a bulk of the baselining for you, and work with you to ensure your plan gets approved without any hiccups. All right, to wrap up, a few takeaways. The first is BNG is now an unavoidable process for all developers. So really encourage you to skill up on what this means for you and how you can be proactive about it. The next is focus on understanding the details and get it right the first time. The more you kind of fiddle around with trying to do the bare minimum and getting it rejected by LPAs, the more your project can be delayed. Do it well, do it right, and get it approved the first time round. And with that, poor BNG planning can equal the risk of rejection or delay. So really be proactive, do the planning and model scenarios so you can present a strong case to your LPA that you have considered biodiversity not just today, but for 30 years to come. And then finally, really leverage data, tech, and partnerships. They really are the key to success in a successful project. So think about how you can use tools to manage and understand the data that you need in order to achieve this process. All right. I hope you found this valuable. If you have any questions or you would like to understand more about how our platform can support you, please feel free to reach out via hello@xylosystems.org, or you can also check out our website for more. We would love to see how we could support you.